The stagecoach lurched sideways the instant the first rifle shot cracked across the dry creek bottom, and Rebecca Beckett felt the world tip beneath her like a ship taking a wave broadside. She had been holding her satchel against her knees, watching the brown Kansas grass roll past the window in the shimmering heat, when the driver shouted something she could not make out over the scream of the horses. Then came the second shot, and the coach struck a deep rut at speed, and the whole frame groaned and rolled onto its side with a violence that threw her against the door and knocked the breath clean out of her chest. For a moment there was only dust and the terrible high whinnying of the team, and a woman somewhere above her sobbing in short, panicked gasps. Rebecca did not let herself lie still. She had learned long ago, crossing an ocean with two younger siblings and a dying father, that stillness in a crisis was its own kind of death. She pushed against the door that was now above her like a hatch, forced it open with her shoulder, and hauled herself up through it into blinding white daylight and the smell of scorched grass and gunpowder. Riders. 4 of them, maybe 5, circling wide of the wrecked coach on lathered horses, firing into the air, whooping like men enjoying themselves far too much for it to be an honest robbery. The driver was down in the road, clutching his arm, and the second passenger, an older woman named Mrs. Dunmore who had chattered the entire ride from the depot about her son's cattle, was pinned beneath the coach door, her skirts caught, her face gray with terror. "Hold on," Rebecca called down to her, and swung herself off the top of the overturned coach, landing hard on her heels in the dust. She did not have a knife long enough to cut the leather traces binding the door, but she had her father's folding blade in her boot, the one she had carried since Glasgow, and her hands were steady enough to use it even as a bullet kicked up dirt not 4 feet from her. She sawed at the strap pinning Mrs. Dunmore's skirt to the splintered door frame, murmuring nonsense reassurances the way she once had to frighten schoolchildren, and did not look up when the hoofbeats grew louder, because looking up would not help either of them. It was the sound of a different kind of shot that made her look up. Not wild and celebratory like the others, but flat and purposeful, and a rider went down hard off his horse not 30 yards away with a cry of pain rather than death. A second horseman wheeled his mount, cursing, and Rebecca saw the man who had fired. He came in at a gallop along the creek bank, a rifle braced against his shoulder, and worked one-handed with a competence that told her this was not his first fight. His hat gone somewhere behind him, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, and he did not slow as he closed the distance, only shifted his aim and fired again, and a second rider's hat flew off his head, which seemed to convince the man that continuing the argument was unwise. The 4 remaining riders broke off, shouting to one another, and thundered away south along the dry creek, leaving one of their number crawling for his fallen horse and abandoning him when the horse would not be caught. The whole encounter, start to finish, could not have lasted 90 seconds, though it had felt to Rebecca like the longest 90 seconds of her life, longer even than the crossing from Greenock to New York, longer than the day her father had been laid in the ground on the Kansas prairie, because there had been no time to build a proper church. The rider hauled his horse up hard beside the wreck and was off it before it had fully stopped, and it was only then, watching him move, that Rebecca understood how young he was. She had expected, from the letters her uncle had sent describing the man hired to see the last of the family's belongings, and the Beckett women safely across the last dangerous stretch of the Kansas plains, someone weathered by 40 years of trail dust, someone with a gray beard and a limp, and the patient, unhurried manner of an old plainsman who had seen every kind of trouble there was and outlived it. Albert Ralston, her uncle's letter had said, is the best wagon master left on this stretch of country, and there is nobody I would trust more with what remains of our family. The man crouched now beside Mrs. Dunmore, easing the last of the leather strap free where Rebecca's knife had not quite finished the cut, and lifting the older woman clear with an arm that did not so much as tremble under the weight, could not have been more than 30 years old. His face, under the sweat and the dust, was clean-shaven, sharp at the jaw, with eyes the pale gray-blue of a winter sky, and there was nothing about him, nothing at all, that matched the picture she had built in her mind on the long train ride west. "You hurt, ma'am?" he asked Mrs. Dunmore, and then, not waiting for the answer, turned to Rebecca. "I am unharmed," Rebecca said, and was faintly annoyed at how breathless it came out. "The driver is not. His arm." He was already moving toward the driver, an older man clutching his forearm with a grimace, and Rebecca followed, because there was work to be done, and she had never in her life been the sort of woman who stood aside while there was work to be done. Between them, they got the driver's sleeve cut back, and Rebecca saw at once that the bone had not broken through the skin, which was a mercy, and bound it tight with a strip torn from her own petticoat, while the young man held the arm steady and did not comment on the fact that a lady fresh off the train had produced a folding knife from her boot without the slightest hesitation. It was only when a second horse came up the trail at a trot, ridden by a leathery old man with a white mustache and a shotgun across his saddle, that Rebecca made her mistake. "Mr. Ralston," she said, straightening, addressing the old man with relief, because here finally was the person she had come 3,000 miles and one overturned stagecoach to meet. "Thank the Lord. I feared the worst when I saw the shooting start." The old man on the horse looked at her, then at the younger one crouched by the driver, and something like amusement crossed his weathered face. "Wrong fellow, miss," he said. "Name's Hank Given. I just work for him." He nodded toward the younger man, who had risen now and was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between wariness and a reluctant, dawning humor. "Albert Ralston," he said, and touched 2 fingers to a hat brim that was not there, having lost the hat somewhere on his approach, which seemed to strike him as an amusing enough thing that the corner of his mouth twitched despite the circumstances. "I take it you're one of the Beckett family, then. You'd be Rebecca." "I am," Rebecca said, feeling heat climb into her face that had nothing to do with the Kansas sun. "Forgive me. My uncle's letters described a man of considerably more years." "I've been told that before," Albert said. "Usually right before somebody decides I can't do the job on account of my face. You planning to decide that too, Miss Beckett?" There was nothing unkind in the way he said it, but there was a challenge folded into it all the same, and Rebecca found herself lifting her chin the way she had lifted it at every schoolmaster and shipping clerk and customs officer who had ever looked at her, and seen only a young woman traveling without a husband. "I have not yet decided anything about you at all, Mr. Ralston," she said, "beyond the fact that you shoot a rifle a great deal better than the men who attacked us, and that I would very much like to know why 4 riders thought it worth their trouble to ambush a stagecoach on an empty stretch of prairie road." Something shifted in his face at that, a flicker of respect, quickly banked. "So would I," he said. "That's twice this month somebody's tried to put a scare into travelers on this road, and both times it was aimed at folks bound for Beckett land." He glanced past her at the wrecked coach, at Hank Given already cutting the injured horses free of the wreckage, at the flat brown miles of drought-struck grass stretching in every direction under a sky bleached the color of bone. "Reckon we'd best get you to your uncle's place before we stand out here discussing it further. There's been enough trouble on this road for one afternoon." Rebecca looked back once at the overturned coach, at the driver being helped onto Hank Given's horse, at the dust still hanging in the still, superheated air where the ambushers had fled, and felt for the first time since she had stepped off the train in Dodge City 3 hours earlier that she had arrived somewhere the letters home had not prepared her for at all. The Beckett claim sat 11 miles south of Dodge City along the twisting course of Saw Log Creek, 160 acres of dry grass, and one good stand of cottonwoods that her Uncle Robert had proved up 2 years before, and which her father, in the last failing months of his life, had scraped together enough to add a second claim beside it for his own family, so that when he died, the land would be there waiting for his children, the way the promise of it had carried him across an ocean and half a continent. It had not carried Rebecca's younger sister very far past it, apparently. Her Uncle Robert met them at the sodden timber house with his hat already off and worry written plain across a face that had aged 10 years since Rebecca had last seen it in a photograph. And before she had even climbed down from Hank Given's borrowed horse, he was talking, fast and low, the way men talked when they had been carrying bad news alone for too many days and could not get it out quickly enough now that someone had finally arrived to share the weight of it. "She's gone, Rebecca. 4 days now. I didn't want to put it in a telegram, didn't want to frighten your brother before you'd even left Scotland, but she is gone and I have looked everywhere a man can look in a county this size. And Albert here has looked further than that. And there's no trace of her beyond what I'm about to show you, and I don't like what it says, and I don't know what to do." Tam came out onto the step then, 16 years old and trying very hard to look like a man who did not need his older sister to arrive and fix things, and Rebecca held him for a long moment with her eyes shut against the sun, and did not cry, because there would be time for crying later and none of it would bring Flora back 1 hour sooner. "Show me," she said to her uncle, when she had let Tam go. What he showed her, inside the low, cool dark of the sod house, was a single folded sheet of paper that had been left on Flora's narrow bed, tucked half beneath the pillow as though she had wanted it found but not immediately. Rebecca read it twice, standing very still, aware of Albert Ralston in the doorway behind her, not intruding but not leaving either, and of her uncle wringing his hat brim in both hands. "I am sorry to go without a proper goodbye," the letter said, in Flora's careful schoolroom hand, "but I could not bear another conversation about Wendell Hargrove, and I could not bear to be the reason this family's land is safe while my own life is not mine to choose. Do not look for me. I am well and I am loved and I will write when I can. Tell Rebecca I am sorry I did not wait for her." "Loved," Rebecca said, and heard her own voice come out strange and flat. "By whom?" "There's a young man," her uncle admitted, not meeting her eyes. "A railroad surveyor, come through in the spring laying line for a spur south of Dodge. Calloway his name is. Jamie Calloway. Flora took a liking to him against my wishes, and I told her plain that Wendell Hargrove was a far better match, a settled young man whose father could see this family safe through the drought and whatever else came, and she did not take kindly to being told." "You told my sister who she was to love," Rebecca said, and something cold and clear rose up in her that she recognized distantly as the same anger that had made her stand up to shipping agents and schoolmasters her whole life. As though she were a parcel of land to be traded for water rights. "I did what I thought was right for all of us," her uncle said, stung. "Silas Hargrove's grazing runs share our creek line. A match between our families would have settled every dispute over water for a generation. I did not force her, Rebecca. I only told her my preference as her guardian, and she ran from it rather than argue it out with me like a grown woman." Behind her, Albert Ralston spoke for the first time since they had entered the house, his voice low and careful, the voice of a man picking his way across ground he was not certain would hold his weight. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Beckett, but if your niece ran off of her own choosing, with a man she'd chosen, then there's no crime been committed here beyond a young woman's broken heart over being pushed toward a match she didn't want. That's a hard thing, but it isn't the same trouble as the one that put an ambush on the Dodge Road twice this month." "You think the two aren't connected," Rebecca said, turning to look at him properly for the first time since they had entered the dim little house, and finding that his pale eyes were steady and did not flinch from hers. "I think," Albert said, "that Silas Hargrove wants this creek line bad enough to have tried buying your uncle out twice since spring, and got refused twice, and I think a man like that doesn't take kindly to losing a marriage that would have got him what he wanted without having to pay for it. Whether he had a hand in your sister leaving, or whether he's just aiming to scare your family off the land now that the marriage bargain's fallen through, I can't say yet. But I'd wager good money the ambush and the missing girl are two branches of the same tree." Rebecca looked at the letter again, at Flora's careful hand. At the words "Tell Rebecca I am sorry I did not wait for her," and felt the two truths sitting uneasily together in her chest. Relief that her sister had not been taken by force, and a grief every bit as sharp for having been left behind by choice. "Then I mean to find her," she said, "and hear the rest of it from her own mouth. And I mean to find out exactly what Silas Hargrove thinks he is owed and disabuse him of it." Her uncle started to object, something about the danger, about a young woman not knowing this country, but Albert Ralston cut across him with a look that was not unkind, only certain. "I was hired to see this family's belongings and its women safe across the last of this journey, Mr. Beckett," he said. "Seems to me that job isn't finished while one of them's still out there unaccounted for. I'll take Miss Beckett into Dodge in the morning, and we'll ask around where a railroad surveyor might be found, and we'll do it careful, and we'll do it fast, because this heat's not getting any kinder and neither is Silas Hargrove." He looked at Rebecca then, and there was a question in it, though he did not ask it aloud, whether she meant to argue with him about whether a lady ought to go riding into a cattle town crowded with drovers and speculators and men with guns on their hips, chasing down her wayward sister with her own two hands. Rebecca did not argue. She only said, "Thank you, Mr. Ralston," in a voice that made it plain the thanks were for including her, not for offering to go in her place, and something in the set of his shoulders told her he had understood the distinction exactly as she meant it. Dodge City in the last week of July, in the year of grace 1878, was not a town so much as a wound the drought had opened up along the banks of the Arkansas River. Rebecca had read about the cattle trade in a pamphlet her uncle had sent her the year before, describing the great herds driven up from Texas along the dusty highway of the Kishom and its western branches to meet the railroad, but no pamphlet had prepared her for the reality of it. The bawling of 10,000 longhorns penned along the tracks waiting to be loaded, the smell of dust and manure and wood smoke and unwashed men that hung over the whole town like a second sky, the boardwalks crowded with drovers fresh off the trail spending 3 months' wages in an afternoon, and beneath all of it, the low simmering tension of a town that had not seen honest rain in 6 weeks and was beginning to fray at every seam. Wells were going dry out on the ranches, Albert told her as they rode in, walking their horses to spare them in the heat, and cattle were dying of thirst faster than the drovers could push them along to water, and men who had been civil enough to one another in the spring were coming to blows now over the smallest slights, because the heat did that to people, wore them down to the raw nerve underneath. "It'll break soon," he said, squinting up at a sky that showed no hint of cloud. "It always does, this time of year. Questions whether it breaks before or after somebody does something foolish enough to get themselves shot over it." "You speak as though you have seen this before," Rebecca said. "I've brought 6 wagon trains across this stretch of country in the last 5 years, Albert said. "Every one of them in summer, on account of that being when families move, when the children aren't needed for planting or harvest back east. I've seen droughts and I've seen floods, and I've seen a man shoot his own brother-in-law over a card game gone bad in weather exactly like this. This is my last one, though. My father's ranch needs a man running it full-time now, not one who's off half the year shepherding other folks' dreams across the plains, and I mean to see this family settled before I hang up the trail for good." "Your father," Rebecca began and stopped, hearing the past tense he had used and understanding it a beat too late. "Died 2 winters back," Albert said, without any particular weight on it, the way a man spoke of an old grief he had already carried a long way. "Heart gave out in the cold. I was 3 weeks out on the trail with a wagon train when it happened, and I didn't make it home in time to bury him. Took over the ranch that spring, and I've been running it and guiding trains both ever since, trying to do right by 2 things that both wanted all of a man's time." He glanced sideways at her. "That's why I took your uncle's letter serious, Miss Beckett, though it came with less coin than some. He wrote like a man who'd already lost everything once and couldn't bear the notion of it happening twice. I know something of that feeling." Rebecca found, to her surprise, that she believed him entirely, and that the belief sat in her chest alongside a warmth she had not expected to feel toward a man she had known for less than a full day. "I did not expect," she said carefully, "to find the wagon master my uncle hired to be quite so young, Mr. Ralston. I hope you will forgive my assumption at the roadside. It was unkind of me, however honestly made." "No offense taken," Albert said, and there was real humor in it now, warm and easy. "I've had worse. Had a family from Ohio 3 years back refuse to let me guide them at all until Hank talked me up as his own son on account of they'd paid for experience and didn't believe a man my age had any. Took them 2 washed-out crossings and 1 stampede to change their minds. And did they? They did. Sent me a Christmas letter every year since." He smiled then, briefly, and it transformed his whole face, stripped years and worry off it, and Rebecca understood with an odd little jolt that she had been wrong to think him merely young. He was young, but there was nothing unfinished about him, no softness that spoke of a life untested. He had simply done a great deal of living in a short span of years, the same as she had. "I did not intend to imply I doubted your ability," she said. "I have seen it demonstrated already at some cost to your hat." "Lost that hat proper," Albert agreed. "Bought it in Abilene 4 years back. Had a bullet hole in the brim from a stampede before this, and now it's just gone entirely. Reckon that's a sign it was time for a new one." They found the railroad survey camp before they found Flora, a cluster of tents and a chuck wagon pitched along a bend of the river where the new spur line was being staked out toward the south. And the foreman there, a broad Irishman named Patterson who chewed a dead cigar and eyed Albert with the particular respect one competent man shows another, confirmed that yes, Jamie Calloway had been with the crew until 4 days ago, when he had drawn his pay early and ridden off south with a young woman riding pillion, saying only that he meant to find honest work with the railroad's construction crews further down the line, and did not intend to come back through Dodge until he had something worth coming back for. "Struck me as an honest sort of fellow," Patterson said around the cigar. "Steady hand with a transit, careful with figures, didn't drink more than a man ought. If he ran off with your sister, Miss Beckett, I'd guess it was because he meant to marry her proper somewhere her family couldn't stop it, not because he meant her any harm." "And where south?" Rebecca asked. "Where does this line go?" "Line's aiming for the crossing at Ingalls eventually, and past that toward the Cimarron country," Patterson said. "But there's a work camp presently set up at the old ford on the Arkansas, 12 miles down, where we're staging materials for a bridge crossing before the rails go further. If your fellow meant to find railroad work quick, that camp's the likeliest place. Foreman, there's a hard man named Dietrich, pays cash, doesn't ask too many questions about a man's past so long as his back's strong." Rebecca looked at Albert and saw in his face that he had already reached the same conclusion she had. 12 miles in this heat was not a journey to begin in the last hours of daylight. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "First light before the heat gets ugly. We'll find her, Miss Beckett. I promise you that much." It was not a promise a wagon master was obliged to make, and Rebecca understood that, and something in her chest, some tightly wound thing she had been carrying since her father's funeral, loosened by a fraction at the sound of it. They did not make it out of Dodge City without incident, however, because as they turned their horses back toward the livery where they had left them, 3 men stepped out from the shadowed overhang of the Alhambra Saloon's porch, and the man in the center, silver-haired, dressed in a black frock coat too fine for the dust and heat, was not a stranger to Albert, whatever he was to Rebecca. "Ralston," the silver-haired man said in a voice pitched to carry, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Heard you had some trouble on the Beckett Road yesterday. Terrible thing, ambushers on an open stagecoach road. Ought to be a marshal's business, sorting that kind of trouble out." "It is a marshal's business, Mr. Hargrove," Albert said, and Rebecca felt every muscle in her own body go tight at the name. "I've already spoken to Sheriff Purdy about it this morning, and given him a fair description of the two men whose faces I saw plain before they ran. Something flickered behind Silas Hargrove's eyes, gone as quickly as it came. "I'm sure the sheriff will get to the bottom of it," he said smoothly, and turned his attention to Rebecca with a small, correct bow that made her skin crawl despite its perfect propriety. "You'll be the elder Beckett girl, then. My condolences on your father's passing, and I'm sorry to hear of your sister's disappearance. A terrible worry for your uncle, I imagine, on top of everything else this drought has cost him." "You seem remarkably well informed about my family's private troubles, Mr. Hargrove," Rebecca said, "for a man who has never once, by my uncle's account, been introduced to my sister in person before this week." The two men beside Hargrove shifted, and one of them, a broad-shouldered young man with a soft, unhappy face that did not match the rest of the party at all, looked at his boots as though he wished the ground would open and take him elsewhere. Rebecca guessed, correctly as it turned out, that this was Wendell Hargrove, and that whatever his father's designs on the Beckett land and water, the young man himself had no particular appetite for the marriage his father had arranged. "Dodge City is a small town, Miss Beckett," Silas Hargrove said. "News travels fast in the heat when there's little enough else to occupy men's minds. I'd only offer that if your family should decide, in light of recent difficulties, that the Saw Log Creek claim has become more burden than blessing, I remain willing to make a fair offer for it. A very fair offer. It would spare your uncle a great deal of worry, in a summer that has already given him more than his share." "My uncle's land is not for sale," Rebecca said, "and I would ask you to direct any future offers through him directly rather than through rumor and roadside conversation, Mr. Hargrove. Good afternoon." She turned her horse's head before he could answer, and Albert fell in beside her without a word until they had put 2 full blocks between themselves and the saloon porch. "That man ambushed our stage," Rebecca said once they were clear. "I would stake a great deal on it." "I'd take that bet myself," Albert said. "Can't prove it yet, and Sheriff Purdy's a fair man but a careful one, won't move against Hargrove on a hunch, not with how much money the man's poured into half the businesses on this street. But we'll get proof, Miss Beckett. Men like that always leave a trail somewhere if you look long enough and don't scare easy." "I do not scare easy," Rebecca said, and heard, rather than saw, the small huff of laughter that answer drew from him. "No," Albert agreed. "I'm starting to gather that." They rode south from Dodge City the following morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, while the air still held a memory of the night's relative cool, though even that was thin comfort against a heat that promised, by the set of the sky, to be worse than the day before. Hank Given came with them this time, riding a little apart with his shotgun across his saddle, and an expression of permanent, unhurried watchfulness that Rebecca was coming to understand was simply the old cowboy's natural state. And Tam had begged so hard to come as well that Rebecca had finally relented, on the condition that he do exactly as Albert told him and no more. The land along the river changed as they went, the flat drought-cracked grass giving way to sandier soil and stands of cottonwood clinging to the low bluffs above the Arkansas. And the river itself, when they finally reached sight of it around mid-morning, was a disappointment to Rebecca's eye. A wide, shallow, sluggish brown ribbon threading between sandbars, more mud than water in places, nothing like the rivers of her childhood in Scotland that had run cold and clear and full even in the driest summer. "Don't let it fool you," Albert said when she remarked on it. "This river can rise 10 feet in an hour if there's a storm upstream, even when it looks like you could walk across it dry-footed. I've seen it happen. Whole herds of cattle drowned trying to cross when the water came up faster than anybody expected." "It looks harmless enough today," Rebecca said. "Today," Albert agreed and left it at that, and Rebecca noticed, without quite knowing why she noticed it, that he glanced up at the sky rather more often than the clear blue emptiness of it seemed to warrant. The railroad work camp at the old ford was smaller and rougher than the survey camp they had visited the day before, a scattering of canvas tents and a half-built timber trestle reaching partway out over the river, stacks of lumber and iron fittings piled along the bank waiting to be worked into a bridge, and perhaps 30 men moving among it, all in the growing heat, stripped to their shirt sleeves, sweat-dark and dust-caked. It was Flora who saw them first. She came out from between two tents with a bucket of water in each hand, wearing a plain calico dress Rebecca did not recognize and her hair bound up simply against the heat. And for one long moment, the two sisters simply looked at each other across 30 feet of trampled dirt, and Rebecca felt every carefully rehearsed speech she had prepared on the ride south evaporate out of her entirely. "Rebecca," Flora said, and set the buckets down so quickly that water sloshed over both rims, and then she was crossing the distance between them at a near run, and Rebecca was off her horse and catching her sister in both arms before either of them had said another word. "You are a fool," Rebecca said into her sister's hair, half laughing, half weeping despite every intention she had held to remain composed. "You are a complete and utter fool, Flora Beckett, and you nearly frightened Uncle Robert into an early grave, and I have crossed half the county in this heat to tell you so." "I know," Flora said, muffled against her shoulder. "I know, and I am sorry for the fright, truly I am. But I am not sorry for what I did, Rebecca, and I will not be, no matter how angry you are with me." They separated far enough to look at each other properly, and Rebecca saw, beneath the dust and the sunburn, a clarity in her sister's face that she had not seen there in over a year, not since before their father's illness had settled its slow weight over the whole household. "Tell me," Rebecca said. Flora told her, standing there in the trampled dirt of a railroad camp with the half-built bridge looming behind her, and the river sliding brown and lazy past it. And the story, once told plainly, was not so very different from what the letter had already said, only fuller, warmer, more entirely her sister's own voice. That she had loved Jamie Calloway since the spring, quietly, without telling anyone, because she had known exactly what their uncle's answer would be. That when Wendell Hargrove had begun calling at the house with his father's blessing and his own evident misery, Flora had understood at last that she was about to be traded away for water rights, and neighborly peace the same. Way her father had once been forced from his own tenancy in Scotland for a landlord's convenience, and that she had sworn, in that moment, that she would not cross an ocean to escape one man's ownership of her only to hand herself over to another. That Jamie had asked her, gently, without pressure, whether she would come south with him and marry him properly before a circuit preacher once he had steady work, and she had said yes before he had finished asking. "I did not want to hurt you," Flora finished, "or Tam or Uncle Robert, but I could not stay and watch myself get sold, Rebecca, not after everything Father taught us about a person's right to choose their own life. You of all people should understand that. You were the one who told me on the ship over that we had not crossed an ocean to trade one kind of cage for another." Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, hearing her own words handed back to her, and understood that there was no honest way to argue against them. "I do understand it," she said. "I am still angry that you left without a word to me directly, and I am still going to insist on meeting this Jamie Calloway of yours and forming my own opinion of his character before I give you my blessing. But I understand it, Flora. I am not here to drag you home in chains." It was at that moment, with the sisters still holding each other's hands, that a shout went up from further along the camp, and Rebecca turned to see a broad-shouldered man in a foreman's leather vest striding toward them with two others at his heels, and Jamie Calloway himself emerging from the half-built trestle work with a look of alarm already forming on his face, and behind all of it, riding into camp at a hard trot with 3 men behind him, Silas Hargrove's son Wendell, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth than exactly where he was. "That's Beckett land trespass on railroad company ground," the foreman, Dietrich, was saying loudly to no one in particular, though his eyes were on Flora. "Man came to me 3 days back saying his intended bride's family might come looking, offering good money to keep quiet where he'd gone. Didn't figure it'd bring half of Ford County down on my camp before the bridge was even finished." "Nobody's trespassing, Dietrich," Albert said, swinging down from his horse with an ease that put him immediately between the foreman and the two sisters without appearing to have moved with any particular purpose at all. "This is a family matter, and it's settled peaceable already, by the look of it. No need for you to lose a day's work over it." "Wasn't me that sent for trouble," Dietrich said, jerking his chin toward Wendell Hargrove's approaching riders. "That be them." Wendell Hargrove pulled up his horse a respectful distance off and dismounted alone, leaving the two men with him mounted, and came forward with his hat in his hands and an expression of such genuine misery that Rebecca found her anger toward him, at least, draining away almost before it had fully formed. "Miss Beckett," he said to Rebecca, "I want you to know I never asked my father to arrange any of this. Not the match, not the men on the road, not any of it. I liked your sister well enough to have married her if she'd wished it, but I never wished her unhappy, and when I heard what he'd done to try and force the matter, I came to make certain no harm had come to her, whatever else happens between our fathers." "What has he done, exactly, Mr. Hargrove?" Rebecca asked. "I would very much like to hear it stated plainly." Wendell glanced behind him at the two riders who had come with him and lowered his voice. "He's had men riding the Dodge Road since spring, trying to scare off any family that won't sell claim land along the creek line," he said. "The ambush on your stage wasn't only meant to frighten you, Miss Beckett. My father learned your sister had run, and that the marriage bargain with your uncle was dead, and he means now to force the land sale outright rather than wait on it, before the railroad survey pushes land prices up past what he's willing to pay. He's got men filing false claims of debt against your uncle's property at the land office in Dodge, and he means to have the sheriff serve papers within the week, claiming your uncle owes money he never borrowed. Also, he can force a sale at auction for a fraction of the land's worth." Rebecca felt the whole shape of the past 3 days rearrange itself in her mind, ambush and elopement and speculation resolving suddenly into a single design, and beside her she felt Albert go very still in the particular way of a man doing rapid, furious calculation. "Can you prove any of that, Mr. Hargrove?" Albert asked. "Not accuse it, prove it, in front of the sheriff and the land office clerk." "I've seen the papers on my father's desk," Wendell said. "I copied out the false debt claim myself 2 nights ago, thinking I might need it someday to make this right, though I didn't know when or how." He drew a folded paper from inside his coat, creased and a little sweat damp, and held it out. "I don't love your family's land, Miss Beckett, and I don't love the idea of my own father sitting in a cell over it. But I won't stand by and watch him steal a dead man's claim from his own children, not after what he tried to force on your sister to spare himself the trouble of an honest deal. Take it. Show it to the sheriff. I'll swear to it myself if I must." Rebecca took the paper and read enough of it in a glance to understand that it was exactly what Wendell claimed, a fabricated note of debt bearing a forged signature that did not, even to her unpracticed eye, much resemble her uncle's careful, immigrant's hand, and felt something in her chest unclench that had been wound tight since the first rifle shot on the Dodge Road 2 days before. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. "This took courage, Mr. Hargrove." "Less than it should have," Wendell said, with a small, tired smile. "I should have found it sooner. Get your evidence to Sheriff Purdy before my father learns I've given it up, Miss Beckett. He won't take kindly to it, and I'd rather you were safe in Dodge with the law on your side before he learns which way the wind's turned." They did not linger at the river camp much past that, though Rebecca extracted a promise from Flora, and a rather more solemn one from Jamie Calloway, a lean, serious young man with ink-stained fingers and an evident terror of Rebecca's opinion of him, that both would come to Dodge within the week to see the matter of a proper wedding arranged, with or without their uncle's blessing, though Rebecca privately suspected Robert Beckett's objections would not survive the sight of his niece so plainly, stubbornly happy. The ride back toward Dodge began well enough, under a sky that had begun, for the first time in 6 weeks, to show a faint gathering haze along the western horizon that Albert eyed with a wagon master's practiced suspicion. "Storm building," he said, more to himself than to her. "Might be nothing, might be considerable. This time of year, after a drought this long, when it finally breaks, it doesn't break gentle." "How far to the crossing?" Rebecca asked. 4 miles yet at the old ford below the bluffs," Albert said. "Same one the railroad's bridging, matter of fact, though the trestle's not finished. We'll cross well ahead of any storm if it comes to that." No cause for worry yet, Miss Beckett. There was cause for worry within the hour. The storm that had been a mere haze on the horizon when they left the railroad camp built with a speed that startled even Albert, dark clouds stacking up in defiance of 6 weeks of empty sky. And by the time they reached the bluffs above the old ford, thunder was rolling steadily out of the west, and the first fat drops of rain had begun to strike the dry grass with a sound like distant gunfire. "We cross now," Albert said, raising his voice over a wind that had picked up hard and sudden, smelling of ozone and wet dust. "Before it comes up any further. Hank, get Tam and Miss Flora's things across first, quick as you can manage." They had made it perhaps 2/3 of the way across the wide, shallow ford, the horses picking their way over the sandy bottom with water no higher than their knees, when the storm broke in earnest overhead, and somewhere upstream, unseen and unheard until it was nearly upon them, the real danger arrived. A sudden brown surge of water, thick with debris, roaring down the channel from a cloudburst miles distant that had already emptied itself into every dry gully feeding the river. Rebecca felt her horse stumble as the water rose around its legs with terrifying speed, from knee-deep to belly-deep in the space of a few heartbeats, and heard Albert shouting something she could not make out over the sudden roar of the current and the crack of thunder directly overhead. "Get to the bank. Now, Rebecca, now." She turned her horse's head, but the animal, panicked by the rising water and the debris now battering against its legs, a whole uprooted cottonwood limb sweeping past close enough to graze her boot, reared and threw her. The water that closed over her head was shockingly cold after weeks of relentless heat, and shockingly strong, dragging her downstream with an implacable, muscular force that had nothing at all in common with the sluggish brown ribbon she had dismissed as harmless that very morning. She fought for the surface, got one breath, was pulled under again by the weight of her own soaked skirts, and understood with the strange clarity that comes only in true emergencies that she was in genuine danger of drowning less than 100 yards from where she had been laughing with her sister only hours before. A rope struck the water beside her, close enough that her flailing hand caught it on instinct before her mind had fully registered what it was. "Hold on. Both hands, Rebecca. Hold on and don't let go for anything." She got both hands around the rope and clung to it with every last reserve of strength in her body, and felt herself dragged, choking and half-blind with muddy water, toward the bank, where Albert had one end of the rope anchored around the saddle horn of his horse and the other braced across his own shoulders, walking the horse backward step by careful step up the slope of the bank while Hank Given, already ashore with Tam and Flora, waded out as far as he dared to catch her under the arms and haul her the last few feet onto solid ground. She lay for a moment in the mud and the driving rain, coughing up water, and became aware of Albert dropping down beside her, his hands framing her face, his own breathing ragged. "Rebecca, Rebecca, look at me. Are you hurt? Can you hear me?" "I can hear you," she managed, and coughed again, and found absurdly that she wanted to laugh, the wild, shaking laughter of a person who has just understood how close they came to dying and cannot yet process it as anything but a kind of miracle. "You called me Rebecca. I'll call you anything you like if you tell me you're not hurt," Albert said, and there was something raw in his voice that had nothing to do with the storm. "I am not hurt," Rebecca said, and reached up without entirely deciding to and closed her hand around his wrist where it still rested against her jaw. "You came in after me." "Didn't think about it," Albert admitted. Just did it. Reckon I'd have jumped in myself if the rope hadn't reached, and that would have been a fool thing to do with both of us drowning instead of one, but I didn't much stop to weigh it out at the time. Behind them, the ford that had seemed so shallow and harmless that morning was now a churning brown torrent, and even as they watched, a section of the railroad's half-built timber trestle, undermined by the sudden surge, groaned and gave way with a crack like a rifle shot, sending planking and iron fittings tumbling downstream into the flood. "Would have been under that if we'd been 10 minutes later," Hank Given observed, from a safe distance, wringing water out of his hat. "Don't," Albert said, not looking away from Rebecca's face. "Don't say that just now, Hank." They made a cold, wet camp that night on the high ground above the ruined ford, unable to cross back or forward until the flood subsided, and Rebecca sat wrapped in a blanket that smelled of horse and wood smoke, watching the fire Hank had managed to coax from wet wood, and found Albert settling down beside her with 2 tin cups of scalding, bitter coffee, one of which he held out to her without a word. "I owe you my life," she said after a while, when Flora and Tam had both fallen into the deep, exhausted sleep of people who have survived a fright too large to hold on to while conscious. "You don't owe me anything," Albert said. "That's not how it works in this country or any other. A person doesn't keep a ledger on a thing like that." "No," Rebecca agreed. "I do not suppose they do. I meant it differently, Mr. Ralston. I meant that I am grateful, and that the gratitude has become entangled with a great many other feelings I did not expect to be having about a man I have known for 3 days. He looked at her then, firelight catching the pale gray of his eyes, and did not pretend to misunderstand her. "I expected," he said slowly, "when your uncle's letter first came asking me to see his niece safe across the last of this country, that I'd be minding a schoolteacher who'd faint at the sight of a snake and complain the whole way about the dust. That's the truth of it, Rebecca, and I'm not proud of having thought it, but a man forms his notions off the little he's told, same as you formed yours off a description of an old man. And now," Rebecca asked, "now I've watched you cut a woman free from a wrecked stagecoach with a knife you keep in your boot, and ride into a railroad camp full of strange men without flinching, and pull yourself half-drowned out of a flood without once screaming or fainting or doing any of the things I was braced for, and I don't know what to call the notion I had of you before, except wrong. Entirely wrong." He turned the tin cup in his hands, not looking at her. "I've been guiding families across this country for 5 years, and I've never once, not one single time, wanted to stay put at the end of a job the way I find myself wanting to now." Rebecca set her own cup down carefully in the dirt beside her and reached over and kissed him. It was not a long kiss, nor a practiced one, but it was entirely her own choosing, made with the same steady, deliberate courage she had used to cut a woman free from a burning wreck of a stagecoach 3 days before. And when she drew back far enough to see his face, she found him looking at her with an expression of such open, unguarded astonishment that she nearly laughed aloud. "I did not want to wait," she said, "to discover whether you would ever work up the nerve to do that yourself, Mr. Ralston, given how very careful you have been all week not to overstep where a lady's choices are concerned. I find I have grown rather tired of waiting for things in my life to be decided by someone else's timing. This one, I decided myself." "Well," Albert said, and there was a rough warmth in his voice that had not been there a moment before, "I reckon that's fair, seeing as you're the one who's shown considerably better judgment than me on most everything else this week." He kissed her again, more certainly this time, with the fire crackling low beside them and the storm-washed sky finally clearing overhead to show a scatter of hard, bright stars. And Rebecca thought, with the last clear-headed portion of her mind before she stopped thinking in words at all, that this was very likely the single most reckless thing she had done since stepping off the boat in New York Harbor 2 years before, and that she did not regret one single moment of it. The flood took 2 days to subside enough for safe crossing, and in those 2 days, camped on the bluff above the ruined ford with nothing to do but wait and dry their few salvaged belongings, and watch the brown water slowly recede. Rebecca learned a great deal more about Albert Ralston than she had thought possible to learn about any man in so short a span. That he had taught himself surveying from a borrowed book, so he could lay out fence lines properly on his father's ranch. That he had a scar above his left eyebrow from a fall off a green colt at 14 that he still blamed on his own impatience rather than the horse's temperament. That he sang, quietly and badly, when he thought no one was listening, an old trail song about a girl in Amarillo that made Flora laugh so hard she nearly fell off the log she was sitting on, and that beneath the easy competence he wore like a second skin, he carried a private, gnawing fear that he had told almost no one. That having failed to reach his own father in time, he had spent 5 years pouring himself into other families' safe crossings, partly to prove to himself that he could still be trusted to get people where they needed to go, and partly because a life lived on the trail, always leaving, never quite arriving, was easier to bear than the stillness of a home that might someday be emptied again. "I'm not afraid of the work," he told her on the second night, the fire between them and the stars wheeling slow overhead. "Never have been. It's the staying still that scares me. Staying still is when a man notices what's missing. I have spent 2 years being terrified of exactly the opposite," Rebecca admitted, "of never getting to stay still at all. Of being the eldest and the responsible one and the one who manages everything for the whole of my life, without ever once being permitted simply to want something for myself." She looked at him across the fire. "I find that I want something for myself now, Albert. I want it rather badly." "That a fact?" Albert said, and there was a smile in his voice even before it reached his face. "It is," Rebecca said, "though I should warn you that I have every intention of teaching in Dodge County if the opportunity presents itself, and running my own accounts, and having opinions about how a ranch ought to be managed, and I do not intend to become a quiet, ornamental sort of wife who agrees with everything her husband says merely because he says it." "Rebecca," Albert said, "I have watched you talk down a railroad foreman, disarm a land speculator's son into surrendering evidence against his own father, and cut yourself free of a flood with your own 2 hands. I would be a considerable fool to want anything quieter than what you already are." They crossed back to the Beckett claim 2 days later, once the flood had subsided enough to ford safely at a point further upstream, and found Dodge City still buzzing with the aftermath of the storm, roofs stripped of shingles. One livery barn collapsed entirely, and more usefully, Sheriff Purdy, already in possession of the forged debt paper Wendell Hargrove, had surrendered, along with a signed statement from the young man that had proven, once weighed against the land office's own records, to unravel Silas Hargrove's scheme entirely. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after everything that had preceded it. Silas Hargrove, faced in the sheriff's office with his own son's testimony and a forged signature that a Dodge City Bank clerk was willing to swear under oath, did not match Robert Beckett's hand, did not draw a weapon or attempt to flee, but simply sat very still for a long moment, his face gone the color of old ash, and then asked, in a voice stripped of all its former smoothness, what terms might be reached that did not involve a public trial. The terms, worked out over the following days between Sheriff Purdy, a chastened Robert Beckett, and a Dodge City land attorney Albert knew and trusted, were these. Silas Hargrove would drop all claims against Beckett land, would pay in full for the damage his hired men had done to the stagecoach and for the driver's medical care, and would fund, as quiet restitution that would never appear in any court record but which Wendell insisted upon with a stubbornness that surprised everyone including himself, the rebuilding of the railroad ford crossing into a proper timber bridge, sturdy enough to withstand the next flood, to be opened for the use of every settler family along that stretch of road, not merely the railroad's own convenience. It was, Everyone agreed, a fairer outcome than Silas Hargrove had any right to expect, and a good deal less bloody than it might have been in a wilder year on that stretch of country, and it settled at last the question of whether the Beckett land and the water it touched would remain in Beckett hands. The bridge was finished by the first week of September, once the heat had broken for good, and the drought-parched grass along the Arkansas had begun, tentatively, to green again under a run of ordinary, unremarkable autumn rains. Rebecca stood at the near end of it on the morning of its opening, wearing a dress her sister had helped her sew from good gray wool bought in Dodge City, with Flora beside her, newly married to Jamie Calloway in a small ceremony their uncle had in the end attended with something close to grace, and Tam grinning at her other side in a new collar he kept tugging at. And watched the whole gathered township of settlers and drovers and railroad men cross the new bridge on foot behind a fiddle player Hank Given had produced from somewhere, filling the crisp morning air with a tune too cheerful for anyone to remain solemn beside it. Albert found her there before the crossing began, dressed in a coat she had not seen before, his new hat, purchased at last to replace the one lost on the Dodge Road weeks before, held in both hands. "Sheriff Purdy tells me the town's decided to call it Beckett Crossing," he said, "on account of it being your family's trouble that finally got it built proper. Your uncle's fit to burst with pride over it, though he won't admit as much." "I would have preferred it be called nothing at all and simply be safe," Rebecca said, "but I confess I do not mind the name." "There's something else the town clerk mentioned," Albert said, turning the hat once in his hands in a nervous gesture she had come to recognize over the past 6 weeks as the sign of a man working up to something he had rehearsed and still found difficult to say plainly. "Seems there's no school within 9 miles of here fit to take more than a dozen children, and the county's willing to fund one properly if somebody qualified can be found to run it, and stay put long enough to make it worth building. I mentioned there might be a young woman recently arrived from Scotland with school-teaching credentials and considerably more courage than the job strictly requires." "Albert Ralston," Rebecca said, feeling something bright and unsteady rise in her chest. "Are you offering me a position or something else entirely dressed up as one?" "Both, I reckon," Albert admitted. And there, in front of half of Dodge County, with the fiddle music swelling behind him and the new bridge standing solid and sure over water that had nearly taken both their lives 6 weeks before, he got down on one knee in the trampled grass at the foot of the crossing and asked her, plainly, without any further speeches about ranches or heat waves or the trail he did not intend to walk again without her beside him, whether she would marry him and stay. "I had already decided that," Rebecca said, laughing and crying at once, the way she seemed unable to help doing around this particular man, "somewhere around the moment you pulled me out of that river, if you want the truth of it. I have simply been waiting for you to catch up to your own good sense." "Then say yes properly," Albert said, "so Hank stops betting Tam $1 on whether I'd get the words out before winter." "Yes," Rebecca said, and pulled him up by the lapels of his new coat to kiss him in front of the whole gathered crowd, who cheered loudly enough to startle the fiddle player into missing half a bar. "Yes, Albert Ralston, entirely and completely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in the schoolhouse that had not yet opened its doors to a single student, standing before a circuit preacher with the whole of Ford County's settler families crowded onto benches Albert had built himself in the evenings after ranch work, Flora standing as her sister's witness with Jamie's hand in hers, Tam grinning fit to split his face in the same collar he had worn to the bridge opening, and Hank Given weeping without the slightest shame into a bandana he claimed, unconvincingly, was only there to wipe dust from his eyes. The schoolhouse opened for its first term the following Monday, with Rebecca Beckett Ralston standing at its door to welcome 11 children ranging from 6 years old to 14, the daughter of a homesteading family, and the sons of 2 different drovers and a railroad worker's boy among them, and the new bridge at Beckett Crossing carrying its first proper autumn traffic of wagons and cattle, and travelers safely over water that no longer held any power to surprise the people who had learned, at such cost, exactly how quickly a quiet river could rise. Albert rode out most mornings now to his own ranch, the one his father had built and he had kept running through 5 years of other families' crossings, and rode back most evenings to the small frame house they had built together on a rise above Saw Log Creek, close enough to see the schoolhouse roof from the porch. And some evenings, when the work was done and the light was going gold and long across the grass, Rebecca would walk down to meet him on the road, and they would stand together for a while in the quiet, watching the cattle move slow and easy toward water that no longer had to be fought for, before turning together toward the lit windows of the home that neither of them, 6 months before, could have imagined finding at the end of such a road. She had arrived that first day expecting a rough old man, a stranger's name on a letter, a duty to be endured until it was finished. She had found, instead, a young rancher not yet ready for the life he was about to be given, any more than she had been ready for the life waiting to claim her. And between the two of them, across one long, dangerous, unforgettable week of ambush and flood and hard-won truth, they had built something neither had thought to look for. Not a rescue, not a bargain, but a partnership entered into by two people who had each, in their own way, already proven they did not need saving, and had chosen each other anyway, freely and for good.